20 years ago this Saturday. It's really difficult to believe it's been that long because we've all got those vivid memories. Where were you at the time and what did you do in the months after?
Yeah, well, look, it feels like so many lifetimes since that fateful day, and yet it also feels just like yesterday. Look, I was actually in Sydney and I slept through the actual attacks. So, I woke up to the next morning to learn of the attacks in New York, Washington and Pennsylvania, and, it's so odd. Like so many others, 9/11 changed my life forever, and yet that signature event in my existence, I slept through it. But soon after 9/11, within just a few weeks or a month or so, I was in Afghanistan. And for me, that's when my forever wars began. I arrived at the birthplace of the Taliban, the city of Kandahar, the day after the founder of the Taliban, Mullah Omar, had left. And at that point, I stayed in Kandahar and I began to live as a Taliban. I grew my beard, I dressed like a Taliban, even my Pashto had a thick Kandahari or Taliban accent. And then after a year or so of that, when it became so readily apparent that the West was about to invade Iraq, I went illegally into Iran and then crossed the border illegally into Kurdistan and northern Iraq, and then my Iraq war began. So, and I didn't leave those wars for 10 years. So, like so many of the veterans, and for the Americans, over 3 million, well over 3 million Americans have served in combat since 9/11. And like them, these wars might be over, but they'll never leave us alone.
So you went to live with the Taliban almost immediately in Afghanistan, then went to Iraq. I didn't know that about you, but I do remember your incredible reporting at the time and being essentially embedded with the Taliban. There was, I guess it was 20 years ago that, Twitter and social media and YouTube wasn't such a big thing. So the Taliban needed journalists, but they don't need them as much these days, which means it is a very dangerous job for any journalist at the moment.
Well, it is. Look, I was just lecturing at a university here last week and this point came up. My wars, firstly Afghanistan, but particularly Iraq, that was the last war of the pre-social media age. That was the last old style war. And so, yeah, it's true that unlike today, insurgents or militants, extremists or terrorists, now they can communicate their message and provide their propaganda direct to the consumer. So they simply don't need journalists. But I have to say, they didn't need journalists back then either. Perhaps in other conflicts of that era, combatants did need journalists to get their message out. Not so in my terror wars. So I can tell you, in Iraq, very quickly, journalists were deemed to be legitimate military targets by the Islamic extremists. They started hunting us and killing us. So they clearly didn't feel they needed us even before Twitter to get their message out. What it was for me is that I'd become so deeply embedded in first the Afghan society and the Iraqi society that I all but became Afghan or Iraqi. To this day, I'm an honorary member of one of the largest tribes in the Taliban. And in Iraq, I still go by an Iraqi name, my nom de guerre over there. So it was the fact that I was there with them, in their homes, in their villages, walking like them, talking like them, bouncing their children on my knee, that I eventually became their only trusted Western voice. And that obviously came with with some advantages for me in being able to access and tell the stories and bring these voices from these wars that otherwise wouldn't be told.
Yeah.
But it also came at absolutely horrific personal cost and terrible cost to those around me on the ground.
Do you remember where you were when you heard of the death of Osama bin Laden and the West's reaction, but also the reaction within places like Afghanistan and Pakistan?
Well, yeah, I remember I was actually in Brisbane beginning the slow recovery from my wars when I heard of the death of Osama bin Laden, and I saw the footage beaming out of the United States where crowds had gathered in the middle of the night around the White House to cheer and celebrate. But I also more distinctly remember in June 2006 the killing, the assassination by the West of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the man who created the Islamic State. And I particularly remember that because I was kidnapped and nearly beheaded by his people, and because I was also at the same time in touch with his people and with him himself. I witnessed the birth of the Islamic State, and so I had a very real personal connection to it. But more than that, you know, thinking about it today, it's one of the great legacies, the great awful legacies of 9/11 and the way we all responded to it as nations, because we inadvertently gave birth to the Islamic State by invading Iraq. And we invaded Iraq because of 9/11. There would be no Islamic State, I sincerely believe, if we hadn't set foot in Iraq.
Michael, never enough time with you. Thanks so much for your insights today. I really appreciate it.